When my parents passed, I expected grief, not betrayal. But the real heartbreak came when I found out they'd left every cent, $9 million, to a complete stranger. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence and an eviction notice. I wasn't even allowed at their funeral. People told me to move on, but I couldn't, because something about that stranger didn't sit right with me. And once I started digging, I realized this wasn't just inheritance theft. It was manipulation, deception, and something much darker. And I was ready to burn it all down just to bring the truth into the light. My name is Laura Whitman. I'm 38 years old, single by choice, and I live in a quiet brownstone in Lincoln Park, Chicago. I'm a marketing director for a national skincare brand, one of those jobs where you're always either pitching, presenting, or pretending to sleep at 2 a.m. when your team is texting you updates. But I love it. I worked my way up from assistant to executive, and I've never taken a shortcut in my life. That's something my parents taught me early on. Earn everything you get. Growing up, we weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. My parents, Robert and Elaine Whitman, ran a small accounting firm together for over 30 years. They weren't flashy, but they were respected, steady, salt of the earth kind of people. The kind who still paid bills with checks, balanced their budget every Sunday night, and brought Tupperware to restaurants just in case. We were close. At least I thought we were. I'm an only child, which meant I got all the attention and all the pressure. But it wasn't a bad kind of pressure. It was the kind that made me want to make them proud. I graduated top of my class, got a scholarship to Northwestern, and landed a job before I even walked the stage. And every step of the way, they were there. My biggest cheerleaders. The first call I made whenever something big happened. They even framed my first paycheck. I used to go over to their house every Sunday. Roast chicken potatoes, the smell of rosemary filling the kitchen. Dad would read the paper out loud, editorials, especially because he liked hearing himself argue with them, and Mom would quiz me about dating work, whether I was eating enough vegetables. It was comforting, consistent, home. But in the last 2 years of their lives, things changed. Slowly, at first, little cracks in the routine. Dad would forget the name of a neighbor. Mom started misplacing keys. At first, we laughed it off, chalked it up to aging. But then came the hospital visits, the calls at midnight, the doctor's notes, the words I still hate saying out loud, early onset dementia. It was brutal watching them fade. My strong, sharp, steady parents reduced to confusion, fear, and silence. I tried to be there for them. I shifted my schedule, hired caregivers, visited daily. But it was like trying to hold sand in your hands. No matter how tightly you grip it, still slips through. Toward the end, I noticed they'd become secretive. Locked drawers, hushed phone calls, paperwork I wasn't allowed to see. I chalked it up to paranoia, the illness playing tricks on their minds. But still, it stung. I'd been the one caring for them, checking their meds, running errands. Yet somehow, I was being kept at arm's length. There was one man who kept showing up. Mid-40s, neat hair, polished shoes, polite but distant. He said he was helping them with some legal matters. Called himself a friend of the family. But I'd never seen him before in my life. I asked my mom about him once. She blinked at me, then looked away. He's helping with things you wouldn't understand, she said. I should have pushed harder. I should have trusted my gut, but I didn't. I told myself not to be paranoid, not to complicate an already painful time. After all, they were still my parents. They knew what they were doing, didn't they? When they both passed within 6 months of each other, it felt like the ground dropped beneath me. I went numb. I was angry at the universe, at the disease, at time itself for stealing them so fast. But I wasn't ready for what came next. I wasn't ready to be cut off. No calls from the family lawyer, no invitation to the funeral arrangements, no mention of the will. And when I finally reached out, I was met with silence, or worse, rehearsed apologies from strangers. I found out through a third party that their entire estate, $9 million, had been transferred to that man. The stranger. The one with the polished shoes and practiced smile. Apparently, they'd amended their will 6 months before my dad died, naming him as the sole beneficiary. No one explained why. No one even tried. I stood outside the funeral home, not allowed inside. I wasn't just mourning, I was being erased. And the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. My parents were many things: practical, meticulous, proud. But they weren't careless. They would have never cut me out without a word, not unless something or someone had influenced them. I didn't want their money. I wanted answers. And something told me that man, that stranger now living in the house I grew up in, had more to do with this than anyone was letting on. After the funeral, the one I wasn't allowed to attend, I drove to my parents' house, or what used to be my parents' house. I sat in my car across the street, hands clenched around the steering wheel, staring at the porch I used to sit on every summer. The front window still had my mom's favorite curtains, cream with little blue flowers, but the person inside was a stranger. His name was Thomas Reed. I finally got it from the obituary that ran in the local paper. It listed him as a close family friend and executor of the estate. No mention of me. Not even a line. It was like I'd never existed. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, a legal error, something that could be fixed with a phone call or a meeting. I contacted the family lawyer, Mr. Halberd, someone who'd known my parents for decades, but his secretary told me he was no longer handling their affairs. They had switched representation months earlier. To Thomas's lawyer, a man named Craig Wilkins, someone I'd never heard of, who now controlled everything. Every document, every signature, every piece of my parents' legacy. Funneled through people I didn't know. I left voicemails, emails, certified letters. I even showed up at Wilkins's office only to be told politely but firmly that I had no legal standing to contest the will. Everything had been properly documented, witnessed, notarized, final. That's when I started hearing things. Distant relatives, second cousins, old neighbors began reaching out, awkward and hesitant. "I'm so sorry about your parents," they'd say. "I didn't realize. You weren't involved in the estate." One even asked me, "Did you and your parents have a falling out?" A falling out. I was at their bedside every week. I drove them to doctors, handled their prescriptions, dealt with their confused ramblings when dementia made them forget their own names. I gave up vacations, weekends, my dating life. Everything just to be present for them. And yet somehow, I was the outsider now. The whispers hurt more than I expected. The suggestion that maybe I'd done something wrong, that maybe they'd cut me out on purpose, that I'd been ungrateful or cold or just not enough. But I knew better. I knew my parents. And I knew this wasn't their handwriting. Not emotionally, anyway. They may have signed papers. but they didn't write this story. One night, in a moment of weakness or maybe rage, I tried to go into the house. I still had my old key. I thought maybe I could find something inside. A journal, a letter, a shred of reason behind what had happened. But the locks had been changed, and the security camera on the porch beeped when I stepped onto the welcome mat. The next morning, I got a cease and desist letter from Wilkins's firm. That was when it hit me. They weren't just locking me out of a house. They were locking me out of the truth. I fell into a spiral. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything over and over in my mind, every strange moment in those final months. Every time Mom avoided my questions. Every time Dad looked over my shoulder like he was scared of being overheard. And always Thomas was there, lurking in the background, never too far. I started researching him. What I found, or rather what I didn't find, made my skin crawl. No social media presence, no LinkedIn, no public photos. Just a handful of vague, professional listings and a series of company names that sounded more like shell corporations than real businesses. The more I dug, the more I realized he had a pattern. He showed up in the lives of older couples with no other children or estranged ones. He offered to help with errands, medical paperwork, end-of-life planning. And then somehow, he'd end up listed in their wills. Not always as the full heir, but always with a sizable chunk. Sometimes, he sold their homes. Sometimes, he vanished the day after the funeral. But in my case, he'd gone for everything. $9 million. The value of their house retirement accounts, life insurance policies, and stock investments. All transferred through a new will that no one had seen until after their deaths. What made it worse, what tore something open inside me, was that no one seemed to care. The system didn't care. The lawyers didn't care. Even the family seemed hesitant to get involved. It was like they'd all bought into this twisted narrative that I was the problem. That my parents had somehow turned on me. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I started documenting everything. Emails, timelines, hospital records. I requested care logs, recorded dates, compared signatures. I printed every photo I had of Thomas near my parents and started a file on him: dates, locations, patterns. At night, I'd sit at my dining table, with folders spread out tracing lines with a highlighter like I was building a case for a courtroom. Because in a way I was. I didn't want revenge. Not yet. What I wanted, what I needed was proof. Proof that I hadn't been forgotten, that I hadn't been unloved, that something sinister had slithered into my family, stolen their trust, and rewritten my place in their story. And I wasn't going to rest until I found it. There's a particular kind of pain that comes when your reality is rewritten by someone else's lies. You don't feel it all at once. It's not like a wound or a car crash. It's slower, like frostbite. You only realize you've gone numb when you try to move and nothing answers back. That's what those weeks felt like. I stopped going to work. I took a leave of absence, citing family matters, though no one really pressed. My boss sent one polite email, then silence. Friends invited me out for drinks, dinner, birthday witherings, but I ignored them all. I couldn't imagine sitting across from someone smiling, pretending I still existed in the same world I'd lived in before my parents died. Because in that world I was loved, I was seen. Now, I was a ghost in my own life. I spent most days in my apartment, surrounded by notes and photos. A crime scene of memories. On one wall, I'd taped up every photo I could find of Thomas at the hospital at family cookouts, lurking in the background at my parents' anniversary party. In all those years, I hadn't noticed him, but he'd always been there, like a shadow growing longer. One night, I pulled out an old voice recorder I'd used to interview clients back when I was freelancing. I started talking. Not for anyone else, not to build a podcast or write an article, but just to speak into the void, to remind myself I was real, that this was happening. "My name is Laura Carter," I said quietly, "and my parents were stolen from me before they even died." I kept recording every night. I talked about how my dad used to whistle while mowing the lawn, how my mom always carried peppermint in her purse and called me her lucky star. I described the way they looked at me when I graduated from Northwestern, how proud they were, how my father cried behind his sunglasses but wouldn't admit it. And then I talked about the funeral I didn't get to attend. I'd asked. God, I'd begged. I called Wilkins's office the week of the service and asked, no pleaded to know where it would be held. I just wanted to say goodbye. I didn't even need a seat. I would have stood at the back in black, silent, and invisible. But they refused to give me the address. "The client has requested privacy," the assistant said coldly. The client, not my father, not my mother, just a client. I learned later that the service was held in a private garden near their old church. Closed guest list, mostly neighbors and close friends. My name wasn't on it. But Thomas was there, standing front and center, crying into a handkerchief like he'd lost his whole world. The injustice of it made my stomach burn. I hadn't cried in weeks. I'd been too busy feeling numb, building my paper trail, keeping busy to avoid the truth. But that night, with my recorder in hand and the knowledge of that funeral searing into my gut, I finally broke. I collapsed to the floor of my apartment and sobbed until my ribs ached. And in that pain, something broke free. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was raging. Raging against the silence, against the politeness, against every person who told me to just move on or let the lawyers handle it. I was done being quiet. I needed to know the truth. So I started visiting places, hospitals, pharmacies, care facilities, anywhere my parents had been in those final months. I wore neutral makeup, dressed in soft blazers, smiled politely, and claimed I was updating my records. Most places were happy to oblige. It was at St. Lucia Care Center that I got my first break. The receptionist there remembered me, but also remembered Thomas. He was around a lot, she said. He always signed in as a family friend, but he acted more like a son. A son. I thanked her and went home that night digging through the logs. And sure enough, his name appeared. Again and again. Always in the evenings. Always after visiting hours had technically ended, but someone had let him in, and I noticed something strange. On the nights he visited most often, my parents' medication logs showed inconsistencies, wrong dosages, late pills, sometimes 2 different types of sedatives prescribed that no one had approved. I cross-checked dates, made spreadsheets, highlighted patterns. It wasn't just suspicious. It was deliberate. He'd been sedating them, keeping them groggy, weak, confused, so they'd sign what he put in front of them. That realization hollowed me out, like someone had scooped my insides clean. I kept going. I found a retired nurse who remembered my mom crying once, saying she didn't want to sign that paper, but felt pressured. The nurse had told her to speak to her daughter. My mom had looked up dazed and whispered, "He said Laura doesn't want to be involved anymore. Thomas, he'd told her I didn't care, that I didn't want them, that I was done. He'd stolen not just money, but me from their memories." That's when I knew it wasn't just elder abuse. It was emotional theft. He'd isolated them from their only child, manipulated their fear, and rewritten their narrative so that by the time they died, they believed the lie. I was the bad daughter, the absent one, the selfish one, and Thomas, he was the hero. The final blow came when I visited their financial advisor. I didn't expect to get much, but the receptionist was young and flustered. I showed her my ID, said I was their daughter, and she let something slip. "Oh, you were listed on the previous documents. They just updated their file with the new, primary contact. Previous documents." Before Thomas entered the picture, I'd been the sole beneficiary. It wasn't some rift between us. There was no falling out. There was a replacement. He took my place. When I got home that night, I looked at the photo wall again, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. He hadn't just been lurking. He'd been rehearsing. Every visit, every meal, every chat was a rehearsal for the moment he'd walk into their lives and become someone they trusted more than their own blood. And the world had let him. Why? Because he wore the right sweaters. Because he looked reliable. Because he had soft eyes and always brought soup. People trusted the performance. They always do. But I wasn't going to. Not anymore. I made copies of everything. I digitized the files. I compiled audio logs, printed bank transfers, highlighted medical records. Then I sent them. To the Illinois Elder Abuse and Neglect Division. To the local police precinct. To 2 attorneys I found who specialized in undue influence and fraudulent wills. And then I waited. For weeks, nothing happened. Until one morning, my doorbell rang. It was Detective Monroe from Chicago PD. He held my folder in one hand, the one I'd labeled Read Pattern Evidence. He said he'd seen cases like this before, but never with such meticulous documentation. "You've basically done half our job," he said. I didn't cry. I just nodded and handed him another folder, the one I'd labeled Names of Other Victims, because by now I'd traced Thomas to 3 other families. In each case, the same story: elderly parents, estranged, or distant children. A sudden appearance of a friend named Thomas, followed by legal rewrites, financial withdrawals, and then quiet disappearance. But I wasn't going to let him disappear this time. I was going to shine the brightest light on every lie he told, on every step he took toward stealing what was mine. Not for revenge, at least not only, but for justice, for the girl he erased, for the parents he confused, for every victim who never got the chance to fight back. Because I still remembered who I was, and even if they didn't, even if the world forgot, I wasn't done yet. The investigation wasn't fast. Justice never is. But it moved. Detective Monroe looped in a financial crimes specialist. The attorneys I hired filed for an emergency injunction to freeze the remaining assets. A court order was granted within a week, blocking Thomas from accessing a single cent more from what he stole. But that wasn't enough for me. I didn't just want him penniless. I wanted him exposed. That's when I remembered the recorder. All those nights I'd spent talking into the dark. They weren't just therapy. They were testimony. So I called an old college friend, Jasmine, who now worked as a senior producer for a popular investigative podcast. True crime high-profile stories the kind that stirred public outrage and forced institutions to act faster than courts ever could. I didn't hold back when I pitched her. This isn't just about money. It's about silence. It's about how people like him slip through cracks designed to protect families and how he counted on no one believing the daughter left behind. She agreed instantly. The team came over the next day. We recorded for hours. I told them everything: dates, timelines, names, emotions. I gave them full access to documents, recordings, even the spreadsheet I'd built, tracking Thomas's manipulation. When the episode dropped, titled The Inheritance Stranger, it went viral in 3 days. Thousands of listeners, hundreds of emails, but most haunting of all were the messages from strangers. My aunt was manipulated the same way. We thought we were crazy. Thank you for speaking. I stayed quiet for too long. His face looks familiar. I think he helped my grandfather. Suddenly, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was a pattern, a predator, with more victims than anyone realized, and it turned public pressure into a firestorm. Journalists started calling the DA's office. Elder advocacy groups rallied online. Hashtags popped up on Twitter demanding justice for stolen inheritances. People wanted answers. And Thomas? He vanished. For 3 weeks, he went completely off-grid. No social media. No banking activity. Not even a traffic cam ping. But the police were already watching. Turned out, he had multiple aliases. One of them, David M. Temple, was flagged at a rental property in Iowa. Monroe and his team coordinated with local PD, waited until he stepped out to get groceries, and arrested him in the parking lot. When they brought him in, he didn't deny a thing. He smiled, shrugged. They were lonely, he said. I just gave them someone to believe in. No remorse, no shame. Just a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had done it before. The charges stacked up fast: elder abuse, fraud, identity manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud a legal heir. They even added attempted obstruction for tampering with care records. At his arraignment, he tried to look innocent. Wore a beige sweater, soft eyes, hands folded in front of him, like a model citizen. But I was there, and I stood up when the judge asked if the legal heir wished to make a statement. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply said, he didn't just steal from me. He rewrote my parents' last days. I won't ever get those moments back, but I will make sure no one else loses theirs. The courtroom went silent. The judge nodded slowly. Statement entered into record. His bail was denied. But my work wasn't done yet. The civil trial followed. The attorneys I'd hired dug into every detail: emails, call logs, even handwritten notes my mom had scrawled in a journal. One read, "Thomas says Laura is in Europe, haven't heard her voice in weeks." That tore through the courtroom like a blade. When it came time for the ruling, the judge didn't hesitate. The will was declared invalid due to undue influence and psychological manipulation. Everything Thomas had taken was ordered to be returned to the estate. The accounts, the properties, the trust, all of it. But I didn't want it all for myself, not anymore. What I wanted was to make it mean something. So I took a portion of the money and created something new. The Star Legacy Foundation, named after what my mom always called me, her lucky star. It's a nonprofit that offers legal support and advocacy for victims of inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and family isolation tactics. We fund investigations, run education campaigns, and support whistleblowers who come forward just like I did. Because silence is the predator's favorite weapon. And I wasn't going to let that silence win. As for Thomas, he's serving a 12-year sentence with 3 additional state investigations pending. And I have no doubt that when he gets out, the world will remember, because I made sure his name is attached to the kind of Google results no new family friend can hide from. I don't check his case updates anymore. I don't need to. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just endures. It's been 2 years since the trial ended. Sometimes I still wake up expecting the worst, expecting silence, expecting that ache of being invisible to the people who raised me. But then I walk into my office, the headquarters of the Star Legacy Foundation, and I see walls lined with letters, handwritten notes, emails printed and pinned. Thank you for believing your pain mattered. I thought I was alone. You gave me the courage to speak. That's when I remember I wasn't erased. I was reborn. I thought justice meant taking back what was stolen. But it turned out real justice was about what I chose to build with it. My parents may have been manipulated at the end, but everything they poured into me, their daughter, lives on in every family we help, every elder we protect, every voice we amplify. I go to their grave every Sunday now. No more locked gates, no more excuses, just me, flowers, and the sound of wind in the trees. Sometimes I tell them what's new, how we helped a woman in Georgia reclaim her inheritance, how a retired nurse in Oregon found peace because someone finally believed her story. And sometimes I just stand there, quietly, feeling their presence in the sunlight, in the breeze, in the heartbeat I thought I lost. I was once the daughter left with nothing. Now, I'm the woman who gave everything meaning, and the stranger who tried to write me out of my own story. He forgot the one rule that always catches up to people like him. The truth has a voice, and I used mine.